Scattered throughout the mythology of the Mediterranean world, we find parallels to the story of Noah. From the epic of Atrahasis to the epic of Gilgamesh, there's no shortage of stories of gods finding fault with humanity and electing to wipe them from the face of the planet. Even the story of Noah's flood has its own parallel within itself, as Genesis contains not one, but two entirely separate and contradictory accounts of the flood. But that's not the end of the story, as we've already seen with the Tower of Babel, a tale with numerous similarities, including the end, where survivors go forth to invent all the languages and nations of the world. But Babel isn't the last story to parallel the flood myth. It's not even the last story to parallel the flood myth in the first book of the Bible. I'm your host, Jason, and you're listening to Dragons in Genesis. In the last episode, we encountered a tale in which Abram sold his wife to a pharaoh of Egypt, where she served in his harem in exchange for Abram receiving livestock and slaves. In chapter 16, we learn that one of these Egyptian slaves, a girl named Hagar, is given to Abram in order to bear him a son. You see, Abram's wife Sarai has yet to become pregnant, and Abram is supposed to become the father of a great nation. But to do that, he first has to have children, so Sarai gives Abram access to one of her slave girls. In the ancient world, a slave could serve as a surrogate, and the offspring of such a union would be considered legitimate heirs. We'll see this again with Jacob, as he'll father children with the slaves of both of his wives, and as you might have guessed, the slave girls have no say in the matter. Their owners, in this case Sarai, makes the decision for them. So Hagar, the slave girl owned by Sarai, gets raped by Abram and becomes pregnant. But Sarai has second thoughts and has become displeased with Hagar's pregnancy, so she asked her husband for permission to abuse the girl. Abram, holder of the covenant and father of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, told his wife to do as she pleased. As we'll learn later, it is well within an owner's rights to abuse their property. The Hebrew Bible goes into explicit detail outlining how to properly beat a slave, so Hagar would have been accustomed to such mistreatment. But Sarai's anger wasn't ordinary, and her treatment of Hagar became so severe that the slave girl did the unthinkable. She ran away from her owner. According to one version of the story, Sarai's abuse caused a miscarriage of Hagar's first child, a daughter, and the wife of Abram even used magical curses against the girl, which is what prompted her flight into the desert. Yahweh, adopting human form, came to her by a spring in the wilderness and asked what she was doing there. When she explained to him that she was running from the abuse of Sarai, Yahweh instructed her to return to her abusive owner, and in return, she would become the mother of a great nation herself, with descendants so numerous they would be beyond counting. He then proclaims she must name her son Ishmael, meaning El has heard, and he shall become a wild man who will be the enemy of everyone. Hagar then exclaims that she has seen the face of El and lived. The text jumps ahead to a day when she gives birth to Abram's firstborn son Ishmael, when the patriarch was 86 years old. There are a few things here at the end of the chapter that we need to clear up. First, verse 7 says that this is an angel of Yahweh, but in verse 13 it says that Hagar spoke to Yahweh himself. This is because the word angel is a later addition. This will become common as we progress in our studies. Whenever a god makes a personal appearance, editors will later change it to an angel serving that deity. This is another example of that type of editorial change. Second, the son is named Ishmael to mean that the god El has heard her plight. But in the scene, Yahweh is the active god. This is another example of an editor attempting to claim that El and Yahweh are the same deity. Another thing to mention here is that the author of Genesis 22, the chapter where Isaac is nearly sacrificed, knows nothing of this story. Here in chapter 16, the patriarch is named Abram, and his first son is named Ishmael. But in Genesis 22, his name is Abraham, and he only has a single son, Isaac. Finally, this is an origin story for God's people, just as the story of Jacob is. but it's been repurposed as a story for neighboring tribes. This is why the pronouncement to Hagar, which was meant to be joyous, ends with a curse against Ishmael, so that his neighbors will see him as an enemy. The Judahite editors have changed the story to suit their theological ideals. Chapter 17 brings us the covenant of circumcision. This is our third covenant scene with Abraham, following the deal he made with Yahweh after destroying his father's idols and fleeing to Haran, and the payment made to Melchizedek, followed by the contract with Yahweh that night in chapter 15. We'll have two more origins of the covenant scenes in the next episode. So Abraham is now 99 years old, and Yahweh again appears to him, introducing himself this time as El Shaddai, which was not a title for Yahweh or El Elyon for that matter, but seems to be the name of a god or a goddess associated with national fertility. See episode 4 for more details on this topic. It seems that here in Genesis 17:1, the editors are once again attempting to link two separate gods and pretend that they're one and the same. Remember, when Exodus was compiled, the authors of that text reference a version of Genesis that had no mention of Yahweh, as their stories of the patriarchs always mentioned other gods. So originally, Abram spoke with El Shaddai, and sometime later, a redactor inserted the name of Yahweh to give the impression that Genesis was a monotheistic text. It should also be noted that Yahweh is only mentioned in this one line at the very beginning of the chapter. He's completely absent from the remainder of this story. The covenant, as outlined by El Shaddai, is as follows. If Abram walks in this God's presence and is blameless, then he will be blessed with fertility and will multiply, becoming the father of a multitude of nations. This is the command to be fruitful and multiply that appears in Genesis 1 with El Elyon, but not in the stories of Yahweh, such as Genesis 2. This God who brings national fertility also changes Abram's name to Abraham. This is a symbol of transformation, a common theme in divine visitation stories. We'll see it again in the story of Jacob, when his God cripples the patriarch and subsequently changes his name to Israel. This is also said, in verse 7, to be an everlasting covenant linked with the descendants living in the land of Canaan. This concept, a land deal as reward for faithful worship of a national deity, is only found in writings that stem from the exilic period or later. Prior to being removed from Judah, living in the land where they had always lived wasn't a topic of concern. It was just a given. Only after they had been removed for generations and had no home to call their own did it become something of importance to them. It became a key feature in their literature as they wrote stories to forge a cultural identity in the aftermath of a crippling defeat at the hands of first the Assyrians and later the Babylonians. Part of the covenant is that the residents of Canaan must be circumcised. This is an etiological tale for how the Judahites adopted the practice of circumcision, which they learned from the Egyptians. Here, it's used as part of their cultural identity to separate them from their neighbors, and of course their oppressors. Also, the verb used here to make this covenant means to cut a covenant, quite apt considering they're cutting off their foreskins. You see, ancient covenants were often sealed through animal sacrifice in which a lamb or a goat was cut in half. Now, this practice to unite the people from Babylon with their patron deity discards the animal sacrifice part and replaces it with the removal of a body part. Anyway, back to the story. Sarai likewise gets a name change, becoming Sarah. These name changes are how the authors merge two different stories. In some tales, the couple is named Abram and Sarai. In other stories, they're called Abraham and Sarah. They were always meant to be the same characters, but the biblical editors didn't like minuscule differences, especially when they indicated that different versions of the story might exist. So they overcompensated by having grand tales to explain away the problems. The God promises to give Abraham a son who will also be blessed. Of course, this is another story to explain the descendants of Abram. In the previous version, he had a son named Ishmael with the slave girl Hagar, who likewise spawned 12 male descendants who became the leaders of a great nation. Here we have a new version in which Abraham's line will carry on through Sarah instead of Hagar. After learning that he will be the father of a great nation through a miraculous son who is yet to be born, Abraham falls on his face and laughs at the concept of a 100-year-old man and a 90-year-old woman having a child. The laughing part is important as the word for laughed, yishak, is the same in Hebrew as his son's name, Isaac. We then have a section of the story to explain away the presence of Ishmael, who was already Abraham's son. El, not Yahweh, says that he will bless Ishmael and make of him a great nation as he fathers 12 chieftains, and they will multiply across the land, but will be a separate nation. This is a fragment of an earlier version of the story in which Abram's son was named Ishmael and not Isaac. Both the Ishmael and Isaac stories get included, so the editors had to explain their presence. Thus Ishmael becomes a rejected son and Isaac becomes the favored. Previously, we saw Ishmael receive a curse from Yahweh. Now he receives a blessing. Two different versions of the manner in which he is replaced have been included, just as two different descendants have been included. In this version, the covenant made with Abraham extends through the line of Isaac, but bypasses the line of Ishmael. To pass along this covenant, Abraham took his son Ishmael and all the male members of his house, including the slaves he purchased as property, and cut off their foreskins. This paragraph here indicates that the covenant was extended through the line of Ishmael, with no mention of Isaac, who was inserted into the chapter at a later date. Chapter 18 gives us another Abraham and Sarah's story. It's one of two stories involving the legendary cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. In both stories, the name of the deity involved is Yahweh, unlike most of the prior stories which featured his father El Elyon. Again, Abraham is at a sacred grove, one of the places where oracles would commune with their gods, and while sitting there, he saw 3 men approaching. So he invited them to his tent to wash their feet, rest, and share a meal. He slaughtered a calf while Sarah made bread and served the meal to his guests. One of the 3 men announced that he would return next year and Sarah would have a son. This time it was Sarah who laughed. The man revealed himself as Yahweh and informed her that she would indeed have a son. Before we move on from this brief scene, we have a couple of things to unpack. First, this is a personal visitation from Yahweh. He arrives at the sacred grove of Mamre with 2 other gods or angels and speaks directly to the couple. We'll see a similar scene when Joshua crosses the Jordan and is visited by Yahweh before his siege of Jericho. In this stage of their mythology, the Jews believe their God to resemble a regular man who sometimes walked the wilderness, wore regular clothing, and sat down for meals. He sought shade from the noonday sun, as we saw in the Eden story, and could impregnate women, as we see hinted at here. Which brings us to our second point. Yahweh arrives personally at the grove to meet not with Abraham, but with Sarah. He inquires about her name in verse 9 and, like the angel in the Gospels, announces the impending pregnancy to the unsuspecting woman in verse 10. Finally, in verse 14, after Sarah expresses doubt, Yahweh rhetorically asks if there is anything too difficult for him to accomplish. We're to understand that, just as Yahweh helped with Cain's conception, so too will he help with the conception of Isaac. Isaac, being semi-divine, will become more clear in the subsequent episodes. Third, we have another tale involving Isaac's name being linked with laughter, this time with Sarah being the one who laughs, not Abraham. This is a duplicate Annunciation story, not meant to be read alongside the previous story in which Abraham was told of the impending pregnancy and expressed incredulity. This is similar to the 2 separate and contradictory Annunciation stories in the Gospels, in which an angel appears to speak to Mary, but in another version of the tale, it is Joseph who receives the divine message concerning the impending birth of Jesus. And the final point for this section, the visitation is centered around the site of an ancient tree cult that worshipped at a specific oak or terebinth tree, similar to Genesis 12, when Abraham was at the oaks of Moreh. Archaeological evidence reveals this was a site of pagan worship with activity that predates Judaism by roughly 2,000 years. It's one more example of how Judaism evolved out of ancient pagan religion and wrote new ideological tales to explain away its links with their ancient Canaanite religion. Later, King Herod, yes, that King Herod, would build an enclosure around one of the various trees that was believed to be the tree, and claimed it to be the specific location for Abraham's meeting with the three visitors. Though there were also other trees which were said to be the official tree of Abraham's meeting, one of which died recently, but a new sprout came up from its remains, though due to the fact that the original tree used in the pagan rites was around 4,500 years ago, and the lifespan of oak and terebinth trees, it's unlikely that any of the proposed trees are the actual sacred trees of Mamre. The real tree was probably long dead by the time Genesis was being written. Anyway, once the trio of gods left, Abraham walked with them a bit to see them off. They walked to an overlook and stared down at Sodom. At this point, we enter a story that's arranged into a chiastic structure, meaning the scenes in the story's later half mirror those in the first half. Here, chapter 18, verse 16, has Abraham looking towards Sodom, which he will do at the end of the story in chapter 19, verse 28. So the first verses mirror the last, and the next verses mirror the verses just before the last, and so on. In the next verses, Yahweh considers telling Abraham about his plans to destroy the city of Sodom. This mirrors the actual destruction in chapter 19, verses 23 to 26. The specific sin of Sodom isn't spelled out, but it's made known by contrasting the behavior of the residents of the city with that of Abraham, who, according to verse 19, is right and just. So we're to understand that the residents of Sodom pervert justice. We'll see examples of this in later works, like Isaiah 3 and 9, as well as Jeremiah 23 and Ezekiel 16. Mistreatment of the poor and weak, taking advantage of travelers and foreign residents were also despicable crimes. But Yahweh, according to verse 20 and 21, doesn't actually know how bad their crimes are, so he must send out scouts to investigate. Remember that they haven't decided to make their God omniscient, omnipotent, or omnipresent yet. Yahweh's two companions, said to be men but understand to be divine beings, continue walking toward the city, while Yahweh and Abraham remain on the hill and watch. Abe asks Yahweh if he really intends to kill everyone in the city, the righteous and the wicked alike. So he begins pleading with Yahweh, attempting to save the people. This is similar to Moses pleading with Yahweh to not destroy all the Israelites after the golden calf incident, and a bunch of other times during their wilderness wanderings. It also mirrors Lot pleading with Zoar in chapter 19, verses 17 to 22. He asks Yahweh if he would still destroy the city if there were 50 righteous people in town, and reminds the vengeful God that he's supposed to be a God of justice. This is ironic because Yahweh is there to punish the city for the crime of injustice, and he hasn't even heard back from his divine scouts, so he doesn't even know if the city is actually sinful or not. Yahweh agrees to spare the city if Abraham can find 50 righteous people. Unfortunately, Abraham knows the reputation of Sodom, which was mentioned in Genesis 13:13 when he and Lot parted ways, so he had his own doubts that he could actually find 50 such people. So he adjusted his figure down to 45. Once Yahweh agreed, Abe adjusted it again, and again, and again, until finally they agreed on 10. In chapter 19, we switch to Lot, who witnesses the arrival of Yahweh's angels into the city. This arrival in Sodom mirrors Lot's departure from Sodom in verses 15 to 16. Lot welcomes the angels, whom he thinks are men, the same way that Abraham welcomed them, by inviting them into his home and offering them a chance to bathe and rest. This is the type of hospitality that is commanded by their laws, which again is meant to contrast Lot and Abraham with the residents of the city who offer only harassment. They said they would sleep in the city square, but at Lot's insistence, they accepted his hospitality and entered his home. Before they went to bed, all the men of Sodom surrounded Lot's house and demanded he turn over his visitors so they might rape them, the worst possible mistreatment of a visitor they could imagine. Lot goes outside to plead with the men surrounding his home in verse 6, offering his 2 daughters to them in place of his visitors, but they reject this appeal in verse 9. This mirrors Lot's plea with his sons-in-law, who likewise reject his appeal in verse 14. And before we move on, Lot is supposed to be a righteous man, which is why he is spared by Yahweh. But his solution to a mob of angry rapists is to offer them his daughters to be raped by all the men of the city. It seems that the people Yahweh sees as righteous fall far short of the mark. This scene is also borrowed from an older tale, which is found in Judges 19. There, the Levite gives away his concubine to be raped to death by the mob. At this point, Lot's 2 guests drag the man inside the house before blinding the crowd with a brilliant light. This reveals to Lot their true nature, that of divine beings, sons of El Elyon, the God Most High. These would be lesser deities under the command of Yahweh, who serve as soldiers and messengers. These messengers ask Lot who else belongs in his family because they were about to annihilate the entire city. This is the center of the story, the middle scene that the other verses pivot around. In this symmetrical tale, the foretelling of Sodom's destruction is the pinnacle, which has no mirror. Though it does call us back to the beginning when Yahweh contemplates the destruction, and it foretells the final scene when the city is ultimately annihilated. At this point, Lot goes outside to speak with the young men who were engaged to the 2 daughters of his that he planned to give up to the crowd. It's difficult to determine by the phrasing if they were fully married to his daughters or if they had only paid Lot for the right. The text is a bit vague, but since the daughters still live in Lot's house, and the sons-in-law don't, it's probably safe to assume that they weren't yet fully married. It should also be pointed out that these 2 lads, who are seen to be righteous enough for the angels to consider sparing them, were among the men outside who were there to gang rape people, as verse 4 states that every single man in the city was present when they surrounded the house, and immediately after the angels rescued Lot is when Lot stepped outside to speak with the 2 lads. So I think it's safe to assume they were part of the crowd. So if we're looking for 10 righteous people in the whole city, our list of possibilities has dwindled from the hundreds or thousands in town to those in Lot's household. That number dwindles further as Lot himself was willing to hand over his daughters to a mob of rapists, and their prospective husbands were among those rapists. This would leave Lot's daughters and his wife as our only potential righteous people, but we'll be whittling down that number shortly. Also, the tale of 2 divine visitors checking in on humanity to determine who is righteous has a parallel in Greek mythology, when Zeus and Hermes do the same, adopting mortal bodies to walk unnoticed among the people of Earth. That story also contains a scene in which Zeus is bargained with and talked out of destroying everyone. Anyway, Lot pleads with his sons-in-law just as he pled with the crowd, and they of course reject him. At daybreak, Lot exits the city with his wife and daughters and try to escape the impending devastation. Led by the divine men, they fled the gates. This mirrors the scene earlier when Lot saw the men enter the city. It's also a reference to the idea that the judgment of Yahweh comes at daybreak. We'll see more of this in the book of Ezekiel. The 2 lesser gods tell Lot and his family to run to the hills and not look back at the city, or they'll be swept away in Yahweh's wrath. Lot begs them to not destroy the town of Zoar, so that he might hide there from the devastation, and just as Yahweh agreed to Abraham's terms, so too do the angels agree to Lot's. This also serves as an etiological tale for the town's name. Lot calls it a small place, which in Hebrew contains the same consonants as the word Zoar. Yahweh then rains down fire and brimstone on the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. Why Gomorrah? It wasn't said to be filled with a gang of rapists. It's assumed that the twin cities were guilty of the same crimes, thus they have earned the same destruction. This mirrors Yahweh's decision to destroy the cities near the beginning of the story. Lot's wife, who has no name, turned back to the city when it was being consumed by flames from heaven and was instantly turned into a pillar of salt, an etiological tale for the salt pillars found in the Dead Sea region. This recalls the warning from the angels not to look back, and it also sets up for the next scene with Lot, which is not a comfortable story and one which is typically overlooked in religious Bible studies. Abraham looked down from the same spot where he had stood before with Yahweh and sees smoke rising from the plain, a scene to mirror the beginning of the story, when he stared down at them while standing beside his deity. The chapter ends with a brief but problematic story in verses 30 to 38, which serves as an etiological tale for the Moabites and the Ammonites. It tells us that Lot was afraid to remain in Zoar, which makes little sense as literal sons of the Most High God assured his safety, and the destruction was done with. But he decides to leave town and hide out in a nearby cave in the hills. His daughters realize that their father is getting old and no longer has a wife, and the two of them are now lacking husbands since they were roasted in the city below, so they coax Lot into drinking too much wine until he passes out. Then the eldest daughter rapes her father in his sleep and becomes pregnant. The next night they repeat their scheme so that the younger daughter is likewise with child. The eldest daughter names her son Meabi, meaning from my father. This is meant to recall the name Moab. The younger daughter named her son Ben-Ami, meaning son of my kin, and meant to recall the name Ammon. Of course, this isn't where entire ethnic groups originated, and it isn't even the earliest etiological tale concerning their names. Originally, it was likely meant to be a reference to their close kinship, and likely linked the Moabites and Ammonites with Abraham or Jacob. From my father was probably used in a story in which the patriarch had relations with a second wife or a slave girl, like Hagar, and had a secondary set of descendants. Something similar would have been used for the Ammonites. Son of my kin would have linked them with a cousin or a brother. Here, the tales of kinship have been repurposed in the post-exilic period, when the Israelites and Judahites are forging closer communal identities by excluding themselves from their neighbors. They admit that these other Semitic groups are their relatives, but they do so grudgingly, by claiming that they're also incestuous bastards. And I'm sure these people didn't take kindly to these stories. Also, this won't be the last time that we find a tale of a woman raping a sleeping man in the Bible. The titular character in the book of Ruth will do exactly that to get her own way. We must also mention that this scene, tacked on to the end of the tale, parallels the scene of Noah's castration covered in the beginning of episode 7, complete with the sexual crime of his children and his drunkenness. There are also other parallels as well, such as Yahweh coming down to see the wickedness of the people, proclaiming judgment, finding a righteous man to escape that judgment with his family, and that man's descendants going on to birth entire nations named for their children. Also, that story we mentioned earlier where Zeus and Hermes disguised themselves as humans and ventured around testing mortals to determine who was righteous and who was wicked, that was a flood story. That's going to wrap it up for this episode. You can help the show by giving a review on your favorite podcast app or by heading over to dragonsandgenesis.com, where you can find links to donate, join my Patreon, send books from my wish list, find a list of recommended reading, and get information on the latest episodes. And as always, thank you for listening.